I've been looking forward to this program for some time because it's a topic that I don't ever recall we having a program on it in the 40 whatever years that we've had a roundtable here in Central Missouri. And I don't know whether Mike coerced his wife, Susan, into doing this program or she volunteered to do it. However it is, but I anticipate good stuff. Susan retired in 2018 after a 45-year public health career and teaching for a good part of that time and 15 years of teaching history of nursing. So I think we're getting it like from the horse's mouth on the history of nursing in the Civil War. So, Miss Susan, go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Harold. Actually, when I saw your plea about needing speakers, I said to Michael, you can do one and I'll do one. And he said, okay. So I kind of
All right.
coerced him. Okay. I'm going to talk about nursing in the U.S. Civil War, 1860 to 1865. And I'm going to talk a little bit about views of women, then notable people in history and some of the uh, advances that came out of the Civil War that have really helped in the nursing profession. When the Civil War began, a trained nurse was just a concept. Women were already caring for patients as nurses in England. American women were perceived as too delicate and mentally inferior to do the same work in the United States. It was also thought they would be in danger if they cared for strange men. However, many women were already working undercover as abolitionists and as humanitarians. So women answered the call. Initially, there were hundreds of women who applied within 3 weeks after the United States Civil War began in 1861. 100 women were selected initially and sent to a training course in New York City. Ultimately, by the end of the war, there were 9,000 nurses on the Union side. Many notable women and many unnoted would harness their skills and power to care for the wounded and sick in the Civil War. They were the earliest known nurses in the United States, and their efforts started nursing on a career to becoming a profession. One of the most notable, probably, that many people think about is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea was born in Maine and raised by her grandmother. She herself had several personal bouts of illness and became very interested in working with the mentally ill. She opened 2 asylums for the mentally ill in North Carolina and New Jersey. She later opened another one in Illinois. And at the time, that this was pretty unusual for women to be even thinking about working with the mentally ill patient. In 1861, she was appointed superintendent of nurses by the Secretary of War. Her requirements for women in nursing were that they had to be under age 35, plain looking, dressed in brown or black. They had to have good morals and common sense, and they were paid $12 a month. Dix went on to supervise the nursing personnel in the Civil War. She also was appointed the superintendent of what was called the U.S. Sanitary Commission in 1863. This was a private relief agency funded by federal legislation, and it raised money to care for sick and wounded soldiers. So over the course of the war, the Sanitary Commission raised $25 million. The money was raised through sanitary fairs, as they were called, in cities, and often included parades, speeches, and sometimes a circus. The purpose of the Sanitary Commission was to take care of the physical and mental health of the soldiers, assist in the organization of military hospitals and camps, and aid in the transportation of the wounded. They also distributed food, medical supplies, and clothing. And later on, probably about 1863, 64, a Western branch of the Sanitary Commission also opened, which took care of all the needs of the soldiers along the Mississippi River. Some other notable nurses, Walt Whitman, the poet. Some of you might be familiar with Walt Whitman. Walt served in hospitals around the Potomac, and he wrote quite a bit about his experiences. He was one of the few, in fact, he was just about the only notable male nurse that I could find in the whole collection of notable nurses in the Civil War. Another one was Louisa May Alcott, and you probably remember Louisa from her work as the author of Little Women. She also wrote a book called Hospital Sketches, and she wrote it under the pen name of Tribulation Periwinkle. She worked at the Union Hospital in Washington, D.C., and like many of the nurses of her time, and eventually developed typhoid because she became exhausted. I'm going to read you a little bit of her excerpts from her book, Hospital Sketches. A day, what shall we do? She asks as 40 ambulances of wounded arrive. Wash, dress, feed, warm, nurse. You won't have time to sit down all day and may think you are fortunate to get to bed by midnight. I had rather longed for the wounded to arrive, but when I see the shattered, filthy collection of casualties and smell the vile odors that attend disease, infection, and death, my ardor experiences a sudden chill, and I indulge in a most unpatriotic thought that I wish I was home again safe. I am taken aback when asked to scrub the muddy soldiers. I would rather dance a hornpipe on a stove funnel. I make rounds with the surgeons, learn how to dress wounds. It is long past noon before these basic nursing functions are completed. Then I tend to their minds by writing letters, answering questions, and reading to them. Then it is supper time and the duties are repeated. By midnight, I might be able to sleep, only to be awakened many times during the night by the soldiers. Another notable nurse, and I'm just going to kind of skim through some of these. Anna Platt. Anna worked at the 1,000-bed Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C., and she was one of the first women to receive a veteran's pension. When I think about a hospital that has 1,000 people in it during the Civil War, that is overwhelming if you think about the size of it and everybody that would be in there and the small number of people that were there to take care of the patients. Another interesting thing about Anna that I found in her biography was that she played the accordion, and she used to entertain the soldiers at night with her accordion. Adelaide Spurgeon was another notable nurse. Adelaide emigrated from England in 1860 and worked in the smallpox hospital near Washington, D.C. She later worked for the Army Provost Marshal identifying deserters, so she kind of also worked as a spy. She also developed an illness. She developed septicemia or blood poisoning as a result of her work. And you'll, as you read through some of these, you'll find many of these women, because of the long hours they worked and the conditions they were working in, many of them became ill. Carolyn Burghardt was another famous nurse. She joined the war effort in 1861. She had some training at the Bellevue Hospital in New York, which was pretty unusual at the time. She served at battle sites including Gettysburg and Antietam. She also received a veteran's pension after the war because she developed smallpox and yellow fever, if you can imagine. She was an interesting lady. She went on to earn a medical degree at Howard University. Howard was one of the few places at the time that would admit women for a medical degree. So she graduated and went on to practice in the DC area for quite a while after that. Sarah Thompson. Sarah was born and lived in Greenville, Tennessee. She became a nurse after her husband was killed, and she later was married 2 more times. She capitalized on her war experiences in order to support herself and her children by giving lectures around after the war. So she was kind of in the speaker circuit, so to speak, which I thought was kind of interesting. As I read some of the stories of a lot of these women, they were really very strong people, and it took a lot of guts for them to do what they did. They were not at all put out by the fact that they were women. They were told they couldn't do things. To travel around and talk about your war experiences at the time, I mean, that was pretty unusual, but that's what she did. Let me read you a little bit about her. This is from the historical site of northern Tennessee. Sarah's husband was killed in an ambush. This is her first husband. She was devastated, but instead of wallowing in self-pity, she vowed revenge. She dedicated herself more than ever to the Union cause. It was about that time that a young firecracker of a general named John Hunt Morgan was passing through the area. His recklessness had earned him the moniker, the Thunderbolt of the Confederacy. And when Sarah caught wind that he'd be passing through Greenville, she made up her mind to avenge her husband's death. Now, I'm going to read you some of her exact writings that she has in her historical accounting. I took my sunbonnet in hand and went to the street and met Colonel Williams. And after I had passed the time of day, I asked him to let me go after my cow. He told the guard to let me pass and then to let me come back when I had the cow. And he asked me to give him some milk in return. When I was through the enemy lines, I went after the cow, but when I got to the cow, I threw a rock at her, so she went on down the hill faster, and I went after her. When I was out of sight, I crossed over into a cornfield and went to a friend's house that had aided me more than one time, and got a horse and went to our forces that were at Bull's Gap. Back to the narrative from the Historical Society. When she got to Bull's Gap, her story was met with jeers. Apparently, some of the Union leadership did not believe her. But she persisted and ultimately convinced several other troops to come back to Greenville. Later that night, as she was escorted by Union forces, Sarah spotted General Morgan behind a garden fence outside a tavern. She alerted the Union soldiers, who promptly caught up to Morgan and killed him. According to legend, the General Morgan Inn marks the exact spot in Greenville where his body fell. That was kind of an interesting story there. Another notable nurse, Emma Southwick Brinton. Emma worked at the Armory Square Hospital, which was also the 1,000-bed hospital in Washington, D.C., and she worked at various battle sites. Fredericksburg, the White House Landing, and City Point. She contracted typhoid, which also, of course, got her a veteran's pension. And then after war, she married a surgeon who later died, and she became a newspaper correspondent. In fact, she became a foreign correspondent for the Boston Press. So she had an interesting career. Now, remember, most of these women that I've talked about were not trained as nurses like we think of today. They didn't go to school. They just kind of fell into where they were. I realized what had to be done and learned how to do it. They learned much of the care that they provided from the physicians that they were working with, as primitive as a lot of that was. Clara Barton is probably one of the most famous that everybody knows about. Clara was born in Massachusetts. She at first became an educator, and she worked in schools for 17 years in and around the Oxford, Massachusetts area. She was a rebel type lady. Not a Southern rebel. In 1855, she moved to Washington, D.C., and began work as a clerk in the U.S. Patent Office. This was the first time a woman had received a substantial clerkship in the federal government and at a salary equal to a man's salary. For 3 years, she was abused by the male clerks who didn't want her there, and finally, her position was reduced to that of a copyist because of all the criticism. Under the administration of James Buchanan, she was fired for being called a, quote, Black Republican. After the election of Abraham Lincoln, she returned to the Patent Office in the hope that she could make way for more women in government service. When the war broke out in 1861, she was on site at the Baltimore riot. She was working at the unfinished Capitol building at the site, and that was where soldiers were taken from that particular incident. So she began to work on finding supplies for them and also to caring for the soldiers. From that time forward, she left working as a government employee and became associated with Army work and continued her efforts to collect supplies and work to take care of the Union soldiers. She served in the First Battle of Bull Run, Cedar Mountain, the Second Battle of Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. In 1864, she was appointed by Union General Benjamin Butler as the lady in charge of the hospitals. When the end of the Civil War came, she realized that the War Department had received more than 40,000 letters from families who didn't know where their soldiers, husbands, sons, or whatever were. So she worked for a year to try to find those people and let them know where their soldiers were in the unmarked graves and so on. She continued that work into 1866. In 1869, she traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, and was introduced to the Red Cross. When she returned to the United States, she inaugurated a movement to gain recognition for the International Committee of the Red Cross by the United States government, and she was successful in doing that. She became president of the American branch of the society and held its first official meeting in her apartment, in Washington, D.C. in 1881. Her early work in the Red Cross included aiding victims of the Johnstown flood in 1889 and the Galveston hurricane in 1900. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1973. So she's probably somebody that everybody says, oh yeah, Clara Barton, the Red Cross, and that's true. But she did do a lot during the war for the Union. I thought this was an interesting little tidbit here. There are 23 Civil War nurses buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and many of them received veterans pensions. Not all of the people that I talked about with you are buried in Arlington, but I thought that was a pretty significant number. These women combined strength, organizational skills, and efficiency with what were considered womanly traits and still are of compassion as caregivers. Many faced opposition from surgeons, and many were a force to be reckoned with. I'm going to talk about Mother Bickerdike. If you wonder why nurses are often called mothers or sisters, early nursing, and I'm talking about back in the Middle Ages and forward to about the 1800s, most nurses were Catholic nuns, and so they were called sister. In England, even today, many nurses are still referred to as sister. This particular woman, they didn't call sister. The soldiers named her Mother Bickerdike because they thought she was very motherly. But she was anything but your kindly grandmother. I mean, she was kind to the soldiers, but she did a lot of other things to advance the role of women and the advancement of nursing. She served in Cairo, Illinois, and was, as I said, a force to be reckoned with. On one occasion, a disrespectful Union officer snapped at her, "Madam, you seem to combine in yourself a sick diet kitchen and a medical staff. May I inquire under whose authority you are working?" Without stopping, she replied, "I have received my authority from the Lord God Almighty. Have you anything that ranks higher than that?" She worked in a total of 19 battles, being described as a determined nurse who did not let anyone stand in her way. Her patients has, of course, referred to her as Mother Bickerdike because of her caring nature. She moved with Grant down the Mississippi, establishing more than 300 field hospitals, where she set up laundry services, disinfecting clothes, and then sending them to Chicago for cleaning. Eventually, she obtained washing machines, portable kettles, and mangles, which are large irons for ironing the bedding. She then organized escaped and former slaves to provide laundry services for the hospitals. During the war, she became chief of nursing under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant and served at the Battle of Vicksburg. As chief of nursing, she sometimes deliberately ignored military procedure, and when Grant's staff complained about her behavior, Union General Sherman reportedly threw up his hands and exclaimed, "She outranks me. I can't do anything in the world." Sherman acknowledged that she was one of his best generals, and officers also referred to her as brigadier commander of the hospitals. Sherman was very fond of her, and she followed the Western armies in providing care. As I mentioned, she held the favor of Sherman and also of General Grant, who provided her whatever she needed. So these women were very good at establishing themselves with the higher ups in the military and getting the supplies that they needed and getting permission to do the work that needed to be done. At Sherman's request, she rode at the head of the Grand Review of the Armies in Washington at the end of the war. So quite an interesting lady. Okay, what about women who didn't meet the requirements? Remember, I talked about 100 women selected early on and then eventually 9,000. But many women could not meet the requirements to be nurses, or they were not able to. A lot of them started working in the Ladies' Aid Society. These were 20,000 different organizations organized in the North. Black and white women worked together. There were also aid societies in the South, although nobody's sure how many. Record keeping in the South was not as good as from the North. So the number of societies in the South is unknown. They gathered supplies, they supported families, and they worked from donations. They also purchased donations with money that was donated to them. And they raised a lot of the money at social events like concerts, speeches, dinners, and dances, and so on. So there were kind of little individual groups all over the country in various little cities. they often didn't work together, but they all did the same thing, essentially. And I've talked about nurses in the North, and basically nurses in the North attended to the men, changed bedding, worked with surgeons, and so on. The nurses in the South had a little different kind of practice. Nursing of strange men was not culturally acceptable. The nurses in the South were called matrons rather than nurses, and their duties were primarily to sew, cook, and make bandages. The men, convalescing men, were the ones who served to provide nursing care to the Southern soldiers. They didn't have much monetary support, and because there was a lot of what I would call scalping of supplies and food in the South, the hospitals often had to pay exorbitant prices for food and supplies, so that hindered their efforts. Unlike the Sanitary Commission in the North, there was no organized effort to provide supplies for the wounded. So the South was very hampered in the care of their soldiers. Black nurses also played a prominent role, and I'll talk about a couple in just a minute. During the Civil War, there were as many as 181 Black nurses, both men and women. They worked in convalescent and U.S. government hospitals in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. A famous notable Black nurse, and you may have heard of Sojourner Truth. Sojourner was an abolitionist, an advocate for civil and women's rights. When the war started, she urged young men to join the Union cause and organize supplies for Black troops. After the war, she was honored with an invitation to the White House and became involved with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping the formerly enslaved find jobs and build new lives. When she was in Washington, D.C., she lobbied against segregation. And in the mid-1860s, when a streetcar conductor tried to remove her, she ensured his arrest and won her subsequent case. And as I was reading this, I was thinking she might have been a role model for Rosa Parks. So an interesting lady. Another interesting Black nurse was Harriet Tubman. Harriet was also an abolitionist and a social activist. In 1849, she began bringing slaves to freedom in Maryland. She later worked with John Brown and helped him plan the raid at Harper's Ferry. She married John Tubman, who was a free slave in 1844. During the war, she worked as a cook and a nurse at Port Royal in South Carolina, and then she worked as a spy. She earned money for her nursing work by making and selling pies and root beer. She helped guide the raid at Combahee Ferry, which liberated more than 700 slaves, and is considered the first woman to lead an armed military operation in the United States. I thought that was really interesting because you would think that it would have been at least a white woman that would have led the first operation, and here it was a Black woman. So very, very strong women among the Black population here. And I put in the slide there, she was also called Moses because she led the slaves to freedom. There's also nursing on the Mississippi River. The steamer Red Rover was captured from the Confederates and converted to a hospital ship with $3,500 raised from the Sanitary Commission. The Sisters of the Holy Cross were the first Navy nurses. They served on that ship. The Red Rover also hosted 5 African-American former slaves who were enlisted as boys and were paid to serve as nurses in the Navy. In a letter to a flag officer, George Wise describes the facilities of the ship. The Sanitary Commission gave us $3,500. We have an ice box that holds 300 tons of food and ice. There are bathrooms, laundry, elevator, operating rooms, 9 water closets, blinds to keep out the cinders and smoke, and 2 kitchens. So it was a pretty modern type of hospital ship, and cruised up and down the Mississippi and followed various battles, providing service and care for patients. Okay, nearly 2/3 of all the deaths during the Civil War were due to disease, and that would also include infection, because infections we consider disease. The total reported sick cases for all disease was over 5.8 million, accounting for 57,000 deaths in the North and the South. These causes of morbidity and mortality were a driving force that led to many of the innovations in nursing care that evolved during and after the Civil War. I want to talk about some of those innovations. One of them was good ventilation for hospitals. It was a lot of the innovations that came out of the Civil War sort of happened by accident because nurses started noting that situations changed when they did particular things. One of the things that they did was good ventilation in the hospital. They realized that when people were in very close quarters and the air was very stagnant and people were close together, they had a lot more disease. Of course, they had to also contend with things like malaria from mosquitoes. So there was some consideration then for things like screening. They realized that when they washed their hands, when there was proper nutrition, when there was cleanliness, that people recovered a lot faster, that they had less infection. Another interesting outcome or another innovation was that there was increased female participation in providing hospital care. And of course, this was pretty novel at the time. A triage system. And we think about triage as being a medical type of system, and it is. But in nursing, it also evolved from the Civil War. And I want you to think about triage in this sense. When you go to a large hospital, for example, University Hospital in Columbia, and you're triaged, generally triage is done by the physicians because there's a number of physicians in the hospital ER there. But if you go to a smaller emergency room in a smaller town, you're likely to be triaged by a nurse. So a lot of those systems came out of early triage in the Civil War. If you go now to a hospital and you're admitted as a patient, you're in a particular room, let's say you're in room 10, and tomorrow the nurse comes in and says, we're going to move you to room 12. And so you think, wow, they're always moving people around. Well, that's another part of a nurse triage system, and that's based on the condition of the patient, the availability and the skills of the nurses who are taking care of the patients. So they will move people around in various places in the hospital to provide better clusters of patients who require a particular kind of care. So that's also another kind of triage system. And that sort of happened in the Civil War as well. They began to realize that patients who had contagious diseases need to be separated from patients who had wounds because they would contract the diseases. Even though there was not a lot of knowledge at the time about microbiology, where did germs come from? There was smallpox vaccine available. So the beginnings of understanding what we would call germ warfare was happening at this time. There was also, again, the use of scientific principles to provide nursing care. Again, looking at analyzing data, collecting data, and developing care principles based on those analyses. As the war progressed, it became clear to the women who were functioning as nurses that training was imperative. And nurses had to be organized, they had to be efficient, they had to be skilled. And if they weren't, then the sick and wounded didn't survive. And there were not enough supplies to be provided and used efficiently to take care of people. This led to the establishment of some of the first academic schools of nursing in the United States. One of the first professionally trained nurses in the United States was Linda Richards. Linda's husband was wounded in 1865, and she cared for him at her home in Vermont until his death in 1869. Excuse me. She then went to work at Boston City Hospital to become a nurse. In 1872, she became the first student to enroll in the inaugural class of 5 women at the New England Hospital for Women and Children. In some of her writings, she describes her nursing training. We rose at 5:30 a.m. and left the wards at 9 p.m. to go to our beds, which were in little rooms between the wards. Each nurse took care of a ward with 6 patients, day and night. Many a time I got up 9 or 10 times at night. Often I did not get to sleep before the next call began. We had no evenings out, no hours for study or recreation. Every second week, we were off duty one afternoon from 2 to 5 o'clock. No monthly allowance was given for 3 months. Now, remember, a lot of the training that was going on in the schools of nursing early on in the United States came from the work of Florence Nightingale. And some of these nurses went back to England to study under Florence and to work with some of her information to realize how she collected data and kept detailed record keeping. Using the principles of observation, data collection, and detailed record keeping, nursing care was developed that focused on, again, eliminating poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, and cramped living conditions. The nurses began to notice that morbidity and mortality declined as a result of doing these things. And this is stuff we sort of take for granted today. We think, oh my gosh, wash your hands, eat right, sleep, keep yourself isolated if you're sick. These were novel thoughts at the time, just simply not done. And you also have to consider at the time that there were so many diseases circulating that we don't have today. Polio, smallpox, typhoid, cholera. And in addition to that, all of the infectious diseases that people were acquiring from the wounds, particularly staph infections and strep infections. So things, again, we take for granted today were not known then, and certainly there was not much care provided related to those. Along with the changing perception of the roles and abilities of women, a new profession was created. So that's kind of nursing in a nutshell in the Civil War. If you have questions and I can't answer them, I would be happy to try to look up information for you.
David or Carol has a question.
Sure.
I have a question. Thanks for making this presentation. This is fascinating. Do you have any idea what the percentage of male to female nurses was during the Civil War?
I sure don't. As I was scanning through a lot of my information, looking for notable nurses, Kalish and Kalish, who again I mentioned are kind of the premier writers of nursing history, the only male they talked about was Walt Whitman. So I figured they probably had done a lot of research. I think a lot of the men who gave care were probably convalescing men working as nurses in the field hospitals, for sure in the South. They simply weren't noted in history. Nobody wrote down their names. Nobody wrote what they did. I can't imagine being 2 or 3 nurses in a 1,000-bed field hospital and not calling on men who were there to help you. It had to happen because there just weren't enough people.
I think
yeah, but that's an interesting question.
A lot of times a tent mate, friend, buddy would accompany his wounded companion and kind of care for him till he got ready to come back.
Right.
Other questions?
Yeah, I've got one.
Evan, please.
Yeah. Do you happen to know how many of these nurses directly invoked Florence Nightingale? Did they feel inspired by her?
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did. Linda Richards for sure, because Linda went back to England and studied with Florence.
Okay.
At the time, Florence also had a part in helping to open the Bellevue Hospital School of Nursing, which kind of opened right about the start of the Civil War, although not many people were not many people were attending it at the time. Again, you have to remember that in order to get information back and forth across from one continent to another, there was travel involved. We didn't have the internet and so on. A lot of Florence Nightingale did a lot of writing, but it wasn't necessarily published and taken then over to the United States. They really depended on women in the United States going back to England and working with her and looking at some of her work. And of course, she developed many of her principles in the Crimean War.
Right.
That's where a lot of her writing occurred, right?
Yeah.
So I would say some contact. I don't even know if Florence ever came over to the United States. That's a good question. She may have visited the United States, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Susan, I have a question.
Sure.
We keep hearing about sanitary commissions, and
yes,
why did they call it that, and what exactly did they do?
They primarily raised money and provided supplies. You would think that they would be more involved in like providing care, but they really didn't provide care. They did a lot to distribute supplies. I would say basically raising money around the country in various places and buying whatever was needed to take care of the soldiers and then trying to get it there. They did support some of the nursing care in that regard. Yeah, the term sanitary commission, you'd think it was maybe public health, but as I was doing the reading and as I've thought about this over so many years, they really weren't, it really wasn't a public health type thing. It probably would have been, I don't know what it would have been better called. I don't know. It was basically just, it was kind of like a not-for-profit set up by, this was interesting to me. The federal government, Congress, set it up as a not-for-profit or as a private relief agency. You know, Congress doesn't do that today. If they set anything up, it's government related. So it was a private group. And when I say not-for-profit, I mean, they didn't deal with taxes and that kind of thing. But they had to raise their own money to provide the services that they needed. And I think I mentioned they raised about $25 million over the course of the war, which today would be $496 million in 2025. So they raised a fair amount of money.
I think their events were called sanitary fairs.
Yes, they were sanitary fairs. That's correct.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of it could have been, you know, the wording could have been related to trying to create better environment for the wounded and so on.
Well, are there any other questions? Guys, thank you for joining us this
I have a
evening.
question. Oh,
Sure.
Okay.
I was just wondering, so it seems like nurses were primarily involved with the field hospitals and with the wounded and sick. Did they play any kind of a substantial role in the POW camps on either side that you know of?
Boy, I have no idea. I have never seen anything on that. That's an interesting question.
I've
Yeah.
never read anything of nurses being involved in POW places. I think most of the healthcare and what I remember reading about on POWs was provided by the buddy system. They were big enough, like Andersonville
Right.
would have a doctor, usually not a very well trained doctor, just some old hack kind of, and maybe a hospital to kind of isolate the seriously ill, and that was about it.
I will look that up and see if I can find any data or statistics on that, or see how many, you know, what kind of care they provided. You know, that would be really interesting. I did not encounter that at all in any of the nursing reading that I did. So probably there were not nurses there as such. And Harold's probably right. It was probably provided by other people. I expect it wasn't very good care. I mean, what was going on in these hospitals where there were nurses was, you know, the care was questionable there even, just because they didn't have supplies and they had so much disease and people were in such bad shape when they came in.
I had a comment about in Gettysburg when I was there. They have a where Lincoln's train got off the train at the train station. They have a museum there, and you can follow three people in the Battle of Gettysburg. And I may mispronounce her name, but it was either Cornelia or Cordelia Hancock.
Okay.
Was one of them, and it was kind of interesting because Dorothy Dix would not allow her to participate because she was too pretty. She wasn't.
Oh,
trained.
yeah, exactly.
And she snuck on the train and went to Gettysburg from New Jersey down to Gettysburg and snuck in and started helping people. And she was in a lot of field hospitals. And I think there's some letters of hers, a book I had read, and I can't remember the exact title, but it had the letters she wrote home that talked about her nursing experience.
Oh, wow. What was her name?
I can't remember if it's Cordelia or Cornelia.
Okay.
Hancock.
What was her last name?
Hancock, I believe.
Hancock. Okay. I'll have to look that up.
It was really interesting because you could follow three different characters. There was another bugle boy who was actually assisted in amputations.
Yes.
In Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And then there was a freeman who was never enslaved, but it was dangerous for him in Gettysburg because they could kidnap him, so to speak. and sell them to people in the South. But anyway, he served as, I think, a burial person, and he's buried in a little cemetery there that I think the national park should make. They have the Gettysburg for the white people and all, but he was a
Mhm.
freed Black person that never experienced slavery,
Right.
but he
Right.
also did like burial and stuff like that. I'm sorry, I wandered from your topic. But
That's no, that's fine. Yeah, that's very interesting.
yeah, but I
Wow, yeah.
suggest if you ever get to Gettysburg to go in it's a little museum in the depot, the train station where Lincoln got off.
I was at Gettysburg, but we were there for the reenactment with about 1 million other people. So
Right.
I don't know. I don't know where I don't think we got anywhere near the train depot, and it was pouring down rain on top of it. It was a miserable day. But okay, yeah, that's very interesting. I'll have to look this up and see what I can find. I can probably I'll get online and get maybe to the Historical Society there and see what they've got.
Yeah, and I thought I had read somewhere, I've been reading about different women in the Civil War. It's a topic of interest to me. And I thought I had read something about the prisoners. I don't know if it was Harriet Tubman or someone like her.
Okay.
And don't quote me, but somebody I
Okay.
think did sneak food in and supplies, like more as a spy.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of that went on. We just don't know. And it wasn't recorded.
Right.
Yeah. The people that I talked about, there's something written about them. There are hundreds and hundreds, I'm sure, where there's nothing written. And, many people provided care for the wounded in their homes, near battlefields and so on. Whatever they could do for people, they provided.
Susan?
Well, you did a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you.
Enjoyed it.
David has a question.
Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned that two of the requirements for women, one, they had to be plain looking, couldn't be too pretty, and I've heard that. And you also mentioned they had to be under the age of 36 or 35.
35, right. They had to be under 35.
I understand the looks, they don't want to distract the guys, but under 35 almost seems like reverse. I would think you'd want
Older women?
people who were experienced. Yeah.
They didn't think older women had enough stamina. Now, remember, the life expectancy at that point in time was about 56 or 57. So if you were over 35, you were old. And they needed women who were strong and had a lot of stamina. So that was the reason for the age. Yeah, I read that too, and I thought over 35, that'd be 3/4 of us wouldn't be there. But people weren't living that long.
And nursing then, as it remains today, is a very physically taxing job.
It is. It is. And I think it's gotten more so over time. Yeah.
I heard that the definition of old is somebody that's older than you are.
There you go.
Other questions and comments?
Yeah, Susan, I thought it was I know you talked a little bit about Florence Nightingale and some of the things she did in the Crimea, which one of my kind of side weird interests is the British military during the Victorian times,
Okay.
and I know that I've read a little bit about that. It's the hospital medical care in the British Army in the 18th and 19th century was just god awful.
Yes.
And nobody knew about it until the Crimea, because you started having reporters who were there on the scene,
right,
writing about this, and you had an increasingly literate population in England, and they're reading these articles, and they're like, this is unacceptable. So that I think which had a lot to do with Florence Nightingale and others trying to make that better.
right.
And I don't know if I don't know if the U.S. military learned anything from the Crimea. Probably not. I mean, we weren't involved, but I thought it was interesting you made the connection. That's a good point to make.
Other comments, questions? Susan, thank you so very much.
Well, you're welcome.
It
You're
has been a
welcome.
very
I enjoyed
interesting
doing
program,
this. Thank you.
and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'll show you my last slide here. This is the
Again, thanks, Susan, so awfully much. If nothing else, class dismissed.
Thank you.
See you next month.